Hello, I'm George Liston, CA. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. During the 1990s, America witnessed successive waves of mass gatherings. At the epicenter of these gatherings were the million mass marches of African American men and women. Other groups mounted demonstrations of their own. Individually, these marches gave voice to the grievances of specific groups. Collectively, they may point to something even greater, one of those major shifts in the cultural state of America, marking a new era. All of this suggests enormously important questions. Among them, what is the complex new debate emerging within the African American community? And is America experiencing a new Great Awakening, where questions of identity converge in new and challenging ways? My guest is Deborah Gray White, Distinguished Professor of History at Rutgers University and a current Fellow of the Woodrow Wilson Center. Deborah White, welcome to Dialogue.
Okay, thanks for having me.
It's a delight to have you, Deborah. You're doing some extraordinarily important work. And it's not without controversy because it deals with extremely important issues, as I've said. I'd like to go to the heart of that, Deborah, right at the start of our conversation. There is an expression currently being heard in it's entering the lexicon, to wit, post-black. We've heard it, for example, among artists describing their work, describing the influences on them, African-American artists, but just describing it as post-black as opposed to something else. What is meant by this new expression, Deborah, and why has it engendered such controversy?
Well, I think first of all, it is important to say that some artists use this term and some want to stay away from it because it sends people sort of over the top, and it's sort of like, you know, people go ballistic when you talk about post-black, because the implication is that black people somehow are beyond black. Or that it's a negative sort of connotation that's associated with it. And the way artists use it is that there really is a new generation of artists, and these artists are saying, well, I want to do my work, and it doesn't necessarily have to identify who I am. It doesn't have to scream out that I'm a black artist. If I have a black theme, well then fine, but if there's no black theme, it's art, and I want to be taken for art's sake, and I don't want it to be known as black art. I try to take this and this whole debate, and as I said, there's some people who just are totally in disagreement with this, but I'm trying to use that to really look at where African Americans are at the turn of the 21st century. It's right on the cusp of the millennium, these marches, these 95 and 97. And I'm trying to see what it says about African Americans, and if indeed we can apply this debate that's going on in the art world to what's happening more broadly in African America.
So you're using it, Deborah, that's a very helpful answer. It's kind of a point of departure, if you will, to look at the wider community and perhaps the nation itself as these issues are considered at the, you know, one of the things, and I find it, I hadn't actually heard it before I got acquainted with your work. One of the things that struck me as I began to understand the controversy that builds around it is, it could be seen, as I think you indicated, either as a kind of refutation of blackness, but on the other hand, one could say, or could one say, that it could also suggest a kind of, actually kind of reinforcement and confidence. So much confidence that one can say, well, I am that, of course, but these are my other influences as well, or this is what I'm responding to. In other words, a very individual response, if you will.
Let's go beyond the fact that I'm black. I'm black, and I could shout it all day and all night, but, you know, in my case, I'm also a woman. For many gay and lesbian African Americans, that's going to, their sexuality influences their identity. Obviously, we always know, depending on what generation we're at, that the younger generation always has a different idea about what it means to be black. So really, I think that what this expression is trying to say is that it may be at the center of our identity at some times, and then there are other times when something else. I'm a professor, I'm a historian. that is really what I want to be known as well. Obviously, I am anchored a certain way. I'm black, I'm female, but you know, I don't go around every day saying, "Oh, I'm black and I'm female."
And the point in this being that there is, it is an absolute fact of total personal comfort with and acceptance of and pride in one's blackness, but also saying that I am these other things as well. Is this generational, Deborah? I mean, I was trying to think of how this comes in, who is doing it, who's bringing it forward. I mean, you alluded to the artistic community to start with, young artists in particular.
Right, a new generation of artists who are very intent on exercising their individuality and showing it. But in Black America, I like to think of it historically, because I guess that's my orientation as a historian. At the turn of the 20th century, we had people like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. And I think as an expression of what we might call Black modernism, there was a sense that as African American people, we must band together, we must unify, and you know, because as a people, we will either sink or we will fall together. We will march forward together. Probably the most articulate person who represented this was W.E.B. Du Bois, who said, you know, if there was, you know, if black people are to matter in this world, if we're going to, if among the gaily colored banners, you know, of white people and yellow people and red people, there is to be one black banner, then we have to join hands together. And understandably, this was a time of segregation. It was a time of Jim Crow. It was a time when black people had been disfranchised and were really dealing with systemic terror in this country. And so what this was a philosophy of self-defense. I think that at the turn of the 21st century, that as African Americans, we're somewhere else. Yeah. I'm not quite sure where, but we're somewhere else in terms of our development as a people and our development as individuals.
I thank you for all of that, Deborah. And may I just say to our viewers that everything you've just said is very remarkably brought out in this book of yours, which I've read recently, Too Heavy a Load. It focuses on African American women. In particular in the course of the 20th century. And it does make this point that you just alluded to, that there was this very strong emphasis on unity throughout the previous period. Did that lead, Deborah, and I think you indicated this or suggested this, to a kind of a, almost kind of a monolithic black culture in certain ways, and the ways in which we, or black Americans, met the kinds of pressures that you suggested, the pressures of segregation, of racism, and the history of slavery?
I think it led to a public expression of monolithicness, if there's such a word. Beneath the surface, we have always known we're different, and we have always divided along class lines, we've divided along color lines, we've divided in Black America along ethnic lines. But I think that what's different about the turn of the century is that we're now ready to say it publicly. For example, you get the million men marching separately as men and dealing with their gender identity, and then you get African American women dealing with their gender identity. So there's this understanding that not only that we experience race differently, but that gender really does matter.
Is this happening, Deborah, and this is why I find your work so fascinating, because certain threats recede as other issues advance? For example, racism does exist. I don't think anyone would be foolish enough to say it doesn't, but it's certainly different than in its expression and its effect than it was 50 or 100 years ago. And so we can say that those and segregation, of course, doesn't exist. It's illegal now, at least in terms of law.
It's illegal.
In terms of law, yeah. It does exist, but it's illegal. But as those things have kind of receded, if you will, in a certain way on the horizon, have other issues like class and gender arisen as ways of self-definition? And this is what complicates the picture now.
As well as sexuality. I think the most profound difference is that of class. And we've always had a middle class. And W.E.B. Du Bois gave voice to this when he talked about the talented 10th. But we really do have a talented 10th now, and it's very visible.
This would be an elite.
An elite class. I mean, we see at the very top, someone's like Condoleezza Rice. We see Tiger Woods, Oprah Winfrey. But at the same time, we have a much larger black middle class, and a black middle class that no longer lives with the African American poor. And that's been a real profound change in that when we had de jure segregation, when it was legal, African Americans had to live together, whether we wanted to or not. But now with black people flying to the suburbs, and also some coming back, but nevertheless, the gulf between the African American poor and the middle class has grown, and I think that is making for the biggest difference. But I also want to say that we have a vocal, not that it wasn't always there, but we have a much more vocal black, gay, and lesbian community. And they oppose the heterosexual identity of African Americans and they want a place at the table as well.
Right. All of these forces, and I think you articulate them very well, now coming to the fore, were bubbling perhaps in ferment during the time of the marches, were they not?
Yes.
And perhaps, and I think this is one of the strengths of the work that you're doing, we, and I mean us, the general public, myself certainly, didn't fully appreciate just what these undercurrents might have been doing during both the Million Man and the Million Woman March. Would you articulate that a bit for us?
Well, I think that both Million Man marches and Million Woman marches call for unity. And so from a distance, it looks as if, oh, well, African American men are gathering, and that's an identity march. And African American women are gathering, and that's another identity march. But if you look a little beyond the surface, what you see is that these calls for unity are actually saying, look, we are not unified. And that more than at any other time in the 20th century, we need to come together, if only for unity. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why you don't get an ostensible political agenda at either the Million Man or Million Woman March. You get people calling for healing, and you get people calling for unity, but not for better schools.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
What kind of unity is possible, Deborah? That's what occurs to me now. Because what's coming forward, I think what your work brings out, is this new complexity, recognition of things that are going to have to be contended with. Issues of gender, issues of sexuality, women's rights, etc., within the black community and the larger community. So what kind of unity could be sought? I mean, it's not going to be like it was in the mid-50s.
But I think that one thing is really important, and that is that political scientists show that even we have all of these differences, but at the same time, black people still have a sense of linked fate, of any, greater than any group in this country. In other words, I may be middle class, I may be upper middle class, but I still have a sense, and this is what almost every single poll and survey has demonstrated, that even though I have all these differences, I still believe that what happens to the poor African American somehow affects me. So I think that there's going to be unity, and I think that there will be some sort of political unity. That we right now we only have two parties. It's only the Democratic and Republican Party. Even though there's a lot of differences of opinion, most African Americans still tend to vote Democratic. I think that we can have cultural unity without always agreeing all the time. You know, I mean, and I think that that we are publicly expressing difference. I think that does show confidence in being black.
I like that word confidence. I'd also use the word almost maturity in a way, because I think what you're saying is there's an obvious unity that's forged historically. I mean, the experience of slavery, 250 years of slavery, and what succeeded slavery, which also brought its major challenges, have forged, I think, a cultural identity that's never going to recede. But, and I think this is your point, Deborah, there should be a growing acceptance of diversity.
Yes.
within that.
That
Maybe
there are
that's it.
many ways of being black, and that we don't all have to march lockstep together. And that if we disagree, we can do so publicly without necessarily betraying the race.
This is so strongly generational. I think you might agree with me, because I think there are probably people who are, whose lives, and very senior people, for example, have been lived under such a rigorous and difficult reality that it may be difficult to accept this. But would you think that among younger African Americans in particular, this is the way it's going?
I think we only have to look at one word and the way that word is being used now, the N-word. You see young African Americans using it in all kinds of contexts that even someone of my generation who could be a little bit perhaps more accepting just refuse to use it.
That's a striking point. That's a very good point. I'm going to think about that quite a bit. Let me ask you another question. I was actually had in my mind before you made that comment. What about leadership, Deborah, in these circumstances? Because as contrasted with what the 20th century demanded, if you will, do these new conditions call for different kinds of leadership, or the acceptance of multiple sorts of leaders in different ways? I
think one of the things you heard at both the Million Man and Million Woman marches was multiple forms of leadership. And I think that's one of the reasons why there was such a religious overtone, and there was such an emphasis on healing and atonement and redemption, because, you know, who can't be for that? But it's a lot more, when you get a political agenda, you may have a leader on this side saying, this is what we need, and another. I think that we are so disunited or apart as far as we have such a variety of political views that nowadays there's not one leader. I don't think we'll ever go back to a time of Martin Luther King when we could say he is the black leader. We have multiple leaders, and historically we call these race men and race women, people who made their lives around, their whole life's work was dedicated to working for the race and uplifting the race. But when you look at today, we don't have race leadership.
And on the other hand, on the other side, we don't have that race leadership, but I was just thinking that we do have blacks as heads of major corporations. We have, I think it's Time Warner, American Express, a number.
Right.
So you have blacks in leadership positions were unthinkable, and Secretary of State, et cetera.
Right.
Unthinkable a generation ago. So maybe the leadership issue has been redefined. We
have blacks who are leaders, but not necessarily black leaders. And I do believe that that rate, and to give you one example, I think there's a big issue about Farrakhan, and Farrakhan leading the Million Man March. But if you noticed, and all the polls show, that most of the people who went to the Million Man March said, I don't support Farrakhan. This, I think, is so unheard of in African American life, that there would be a leader who could bring, or someone who could bring that many people to Washington, D.C., and not really be a leader that everybody could support, that you could separate the message from the messenger. I think that signals a totally new era.
I just, by way of comment, I say I think you're absolutely right. But what's striking to me, and I'd like to see if you agree with this, that statement was made in a number of ways over and over again. We want to hear this message. We do not support this messenger. He has problems. We recognize this. It was said repeatedly, and yet the media never seemed to pick it up. In other words, there was this constant reference back to, but how can this be so? You know, how can you have this? You must be supporting Farrakhan. There must be a Farrakhan.
Right. If anything speaks to a quote-unquote post-black era, this does. That we can do the mental gymnastics now to separate a message from a messenger. I can understand the media didn't understand that, because they're going back and they're looking at Martin Luther King, even Malcolm X, and they're thinking that there's going to be one voice. But we need to ask, not why did you do this, but really, what does it say? What kind of error? What's new about this? Or just accept the fact that this is something so new and we need to watch it, we need to study it, we need to understand it rather than just criticize it.
Well said. Is there a spiritual dimension to it, Deborah?
Well,
there certainly
yes.
was too.
I think that when you look at America, period, we are in a new era, and we call it the era of globalization. We talk about postmodernism because you know, we used to be a producer nation and now we're a consumer nation. And whenever you have these grand changes, people's gender roles change, people's cultural roles change, and historically, for both the First Awakening and the Second Great Awakening, and some people say there's a third and even a fourth, whenever we have these sort of major shifts, major economic, cultural shifts, people turn to spiritualism, some sort of spiritualism for the answer, because we're not sure the government really has the answer. Because the government is really, the government itself is undergoing a similar kind of transformation that the American people are going through.
And do you see all of this that we're talking about within the African American community and perhaps spreading out into the wider community as a great awakening now? Are we in it?
Well, first of all, I would say, as Lana Guinier would say, that African Americans represent the miner's canary. That if it's happening in African America, it's going. And if you look at the Promise Keepers, if you look at the other marches of the 1990s, you see the same kinds of issues, gender issues. Sexuality. We're really struggling in America with this sexuality issue, and African Americans are struggling with it throughout the 80s, and it really boiled over at the Million Man March. So yeah, I agree that there's more spiritualism. There's not necessarily more church attendance, but there certainly is a search for some spiritual satisfaction.
You know, I really have to thank you for that Lana Guinier quote about the Black Americans being the canary in the mine, because my sense of it as I read your work and thought about our conversation was that there's something tremendously emblematic about the Black experience in this country. In other words, the things that, if you look at Black history with all its tragedies and privations, it's always been the struggle that's been at the core of the country defining itself.
Absolutely.
To editorialize a bit.
If you look in the 19th century, the abolitionist movement is really what forced the Americans to really understand what does freedom really mean and really question it. And in the end, it resulted in the Civil War. But also, you found the women's movement following upon that. Today, in the 1960s, another women's movement followed right beyond that, and you found the gay movement. You found American Indians. You also found the rise of American conservatism.
Indeed, you did. You know, the question I have in my mind, because I'm moved, quite frankly, to agree with you, to think that these things are coming in just this direction and with just this force. And the question that uncomfortably enters my mind at this very moment, Deborah, is it being recognized as such? You know, I talked a moment ago about the media not seeing certain things as they are. Do you think the country has a growing awareness of what's happening to it as it's happening?
Yes and no. I think as a historian and reading the future from the past, I think it's very hard to see, to understand something while you're going through it. It's only when we look back, because our reference is always what happened in the past. But at the same time, I don't think that you can tell people who've been put out of work because their job has gone south or overseas, or people who are looking in a consumer market, in a service industry for work, that they are not understanding that something is happening to them right now.
Deborah, and I'm so glad you bring that point up, because you actually brought it up before too in what you said. Is class now well, I don't even know what to call it, but the big unanswered issue, or the major challenge, if you will, the society faces, both within the Black American community and within the wider American nation?
Again, I would say yes and no. I would say yes, it is, but I am not sure that Americans, both black and white, understand it. I think that our consciousness is still around race. I think when you wonder what's the matter with Kansas or what's the matter with Ohio, that they could vote Republican, and then with so many jobs going, I still think that there is a racial divide, and there's no question about it, that people perceive things in terms of race. And also, in this country, race has always been an idiom for class. A lot of class issues get worked out within the language of race, even though it's class.
That's right. Race has been the metaphor for so much. So is it a sense that we have to catch up with this reality? It means that the society has to use the word again, mature, and into these recognitions?
Yeah, but I think we have come a long way. I think the fact that so many Americans are unhappy with what happened with Katrina, regardless of race, that they saw gross unfairness and just incompetence, and started asking some questions that hadn't been asked previous. I think that it's slow in coming, but it's coming.
Which leads me to this question as we conclude, Deborah, because I must say you bring to your work not just academic excellence, but a strong personal commitment. It sort of shines through as you speak. So I'm really moved to ask you about your sense of optimism about all this, about the Great Awakening, what it can lead to. Are we going in the right direction? Is progress being made?
Yeah. I'm a kid from New York City, from a housing project in New York City, with a PhD here at the Woodrow Wilson International Center. And it's not just my own personal experience. I know that my parents, who were sharecroppers, wanted this for me, and I know many, I think it works out on both the individual level as well as the national level.
Deborah White, it is an inspiration to talk to you.
Thank you.
Thank you for this conversation.
Thanks.
And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHC Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhcworldview.org. And please join us again right here next week. And thank you for watching. Deborah, thank you for that.